Hello everybody, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here to see all of you to discuss that topic, and I think that of course it's a very important topic, a very important issue that we could summarize this way. So the prevalent forms of knowledge production and uses are inadequate to guarantee the perpetuation of a safe ecological space for our species. So that's, I think we need to make a connection between the metabolic disorganization of the state of the planet and the knowledge problem. And here we are going back to very classical issues in the debate concerning economics and knowledge. Of course, a discussion that was dominated by Friedrich von Hayek. And maybe you have heard about this Brad DeLong piece. He was making a review of James Scott's Think Like a State book. So James Scott's Think Like a State, it's very influential book about how the way state bureaucracy reified the real, and it's the cause of misdynamics in terms of developments. In fact, what Brad DeLong was saying is that this book by this anarchist anthropologist was in fact the final victory of the Austrian. And he explained that within economics, so we are here at the end of the 20th century, within economics, even liberal Canadian social democrats acknowledged that the Austrians won victory in their intellectual debate with the central planners long ago. And James Scott's Think Like a State marks the final stage. Why? Because it shows the spread of what every economics will see as Austrian ideas into political science, sociology, and anthropology as well. And the key argument, which is in fact an argument by Hayek, that is made by Scott, is that the necessarily thin schematic model of social organization and production animating the planning was inadequate as a set of instructions for creating a successful social order. So this is the core of the Austrian argument. And in fact, Brad DeLong is using that title, seeing one's intellectual roots. Why? Because he is accusing Scott of not acknowledging enough the fact that in fact he was 100% anti-Hayekian, which is not completely fair. Because Hayek, of course, was very much more supportive of big corporation, and that was not the case of Scott, but still, he had a point in the sense that the nature of dispersion of knowledge and the fact that knowledge is impossible to articulate was the core of the Austrian argument, and it's also the core of the argument of James Scott. So that's how we ended the last century. And I think that we have a new problem of knowledge. The problem of knowledge in the Anthropocene is summarized a little bit earlier by William Kapp when he explained that the current transformation of the environment is no longer the expression of a growing mastery of the world in which we live, but on the contrary, the sign of a loss of this mastery. And this problem of mastery is a problem of management, policies, and so on, but also of knowledge, I would say. And the question that we need to discuss is what are the kind of institutions that we need to reshape human nature metabolism, and how should we process knowledge to invest, build, and dismantle in order to have an economy that is adequate to the biosphere. And of course, there are many ways to think about a different economy. But I think that one key argument is that there are only two, in the modern era, only two instances of totalization. That doesn't mean that there are no other way to organize the economy, but the two main instances able to propose the global principles are the state, the bureaucracy, and the market. So market finance and planning, political mechanism, are the two main instances of totalization. And of course, you have hybridity, you can have add-ons, but this duality is the core that need to be discussed. So the structure that I propose today will be mostly about discussing, criticizing from the knowledge point of view the problem of green finance, and it seems like if it was symmetrical, but it won't be really symmetrical. I will make the 2/3 on the first part and 1/3 of the last part, which will be more about the possibility of ecological planning, and here in the second part I'm relying more on a book that has been published last year. So what is the promise of green finance? It's to have better capitalists. This is from the NZZ, it's a Swiss newspaper, leading business newspaper, and they explain that we can invest in innovative solutions for the future with a positive impact on nature. So save the planet, be a better capitalist. That will be the kind of motto of green finance. And this argument, in fact, is an argument that is very Hayekian, in the sense that we can rely on individuals. We can trust individuals to deal with the problem. And Hayek was in fact discussing the ecological issue. That was not, of course, the core of his argument, but there are a few chapters where he's dealing with that. And in particular, he said that there is no more justification in a free society for relieving the individuals of the responsibility for the future than there is for claiming that past generations have to have made more provision for us than they did. So this is very important, because he said that in order to deal with resource problem, to the future of the ecological dynamics, we do not have to rely on anything else than relying on individuals. He's very clear about that. And why he's making that argument? Of course, because for him, always, there is a prominence of dispersed knowledge. And he acknowledged the fact that some kind of knowledge are only known by government. He's not completely caricaturing himself. He knows that you have science, he knows that you have bureaucracy, he knows that you have this kind of knowledge that is very difficult for the individual to get access to. But what he says that there is no instance where authority can possess superior knowledge over the facts that ought to influence a specific decision. So there is no instance where authority knows better. There are some instances where the authority knows something that the individual does not know, but it's always possible to disperse, to communicate that specific knowledge to the individuals. So if there is knowledge that is only available at the central level, it should be dispersed. But the other way around, it's not possible. So in making this very strong act of faith about the asymmetry between the capacity to disperse knowledge and the capacity to centralize knowledge. And this argument by Hayek, in fact, was very influential in the past years. And I will argue that we misread Mark Carney's talk, or many people misread Mark Carney's talk about this tragedy of the horizon. So we know, all of you, I suppose, already heard about this talk, where I explained that from a regulator perspective, there is a problem specific with climate change. In general, that's not a problem. There is a reassessment of value. Of course, in financial market, you have reassessment of value. That's the way it works. But here we have a problem if we have a wholesale reassessment of prospects. Why? Because it could potentially destabilize markets, spark a procyclical crystallization of losses, and persistent tightening of financial conditions. So, in other words, the problem for McCartney is that we could have an abrupt resolution of the tragedy of the horizon, which is a financial stability risk. So we know that. But what is less discussed before? That the more we invest with foresight, the less we regret in insight. And the key argument of Carney, in fact, is to create the condition to invest with foresight. Basically, that implies that investors should be able to invest correctly. If they have the good information, they should be able to behave exactly like Hayek supposed that they could be able to deal with the future. And this is a crucial argument. What is this risk? We know that. We have physical risk, so the risk that the value of financial assets will be diminished drastically because of climate and weather-related events. So just think about Los Angeles those days or Valencia. Liability risk, you could sue companies that are responsible for climate change, and there will be, there is already, and there will be more, and that could be some financial risk. And there is transition risk for company because you will have new regulation that will hurt business plans, will hurt the value of some assets. So that's the kind of risk that need to be taken into account. And what Mark Carney says is that we have those risks, but we need to disclose those risks. If they are correctly disclosed, then no problem, because which can be measured can be managed. So financial market can manage those risks if they are aware of those risks. This talk had a huge influence. One of the consequences of that is that central bankers, at least in Europe, change some of their policies. And you have this very good research by Jérôme Deris that is discussing the detail of that. And in particular, we can observe that since the late 2010, we have a very significant increase in the number of time central bankers in Europe will mention climate and will discuss that. And we have a new instrument that were implemented. You also document that. And so that's something that is very present in the ECB discussion. We can measure that. So there is a climate turn, if you want, in central banking, a green turn in central banking. However, we have that, but we need to think about what it is really. And what it is really, in fact, I just take one example, but I think that's the boldest move of the ECB. This boldest move was, in fact, the fact that the ECB decided to account for climate change in its corporate bond purchases. So it was buying bonds in order to fulfill its mandatory mandate relative to financial stability. But while it was buying bonds, it was taking into account climate risk. So that's something very important. And there is his underlying, and I think he's right, that in fact those bonds, that was very significant. Why? Because that marked the end of market neutrality as the organizing and interpretable principles. Why? Because those buyings were not based on risk-based metrics, but explicitly relied on extrinsic objectives, that of climate stabilization. So that seems to be a very significant move on the part of the ECB. Yet, and that's here that I will begin to discuss that, we have a huge number of problems. I will dig into all the problems that we have. The first problem is that those very meaningful green bonds, they are green, who knows? The ECB don't know. That's the key stuff. The central banks, and that's Eric Monet that is saying that, and I think that it's very important, the central bank has no competent staff for studying and choosing investment. They do not know how to do that. They don't have the bureaucracy. They don't have access to the information. Which means that, in fact, when they are buying bonds that are supposed to be greens, they are guessing what is green. They are guessing based on past emissions of corporations. They are guessing about targets. They are guessing about transparency of those corporations. But those guesses, they are based on what? They are based on publicly available information. So basically, that's private corporations, notation agencies that are giving the information to the ECB. So the ECB is making green decisions, but on the basis of private built information that it cannot control. So the key point is that you do not have any kind of market-based green central banking without green assets. And those green assets are green only on the basis of what is provided as information by other entities. So it depends, it's more or less reliable depending on the dimension, but it's not independent from market actors. So that's the first problem that we will go back. The second thing that I just want to stress is the fact that the ECB is moving, but that's not the only one to move, of course. There has been a huge increase, so a little bit less the past months, maybe you realize that. But there used to be a lot of excitement for ESG funding, ESG investment. So the idea of doing well by doing good. So that was a promise of better capitalism that we have seen at the beginning. You can invest in solutions for the future while getting a nice return. So you have this significant increase since 2019 up to 23, I think, last year that shifted, in fact, with the global rise of ESG funds. But they, just as the ECB, rely on also disclosure dimension. And I recommend for those of you working on this issue, this book, which is very fantastic, very detailed, very, very good. And they are discussing all the details of these antinomies of climate finance. But what they stress, and I think is very important, is that by seeking to create market conditions that are more informed about climate change, the objective of disclosure is to reflect a neoliberal understanding of markets. In fact, they are trying to implement the idea of Friedrich Hayek of market as an omniscient information processor to deal with climate challenge. So the idea is that if markets have the good information, then they will be able to deal with the solution. Disclosure requirements aims to provide information to markets so that they can price risk and allocate capital accordingly. In fact, if you follow that closely, that means that even discussion about carbon market or carbon tax are irrelevant. If market got the right information, you do not need any kind of regulation to do that. And this is the hardcore of the argument of Mark Carney, I would say. So, a lot of things are going down here. A lot of things to impact. A lot of factors are involved. And there is this paper just published by Fichtner and his co-authors that is detailing all the actors, how they are implementing. But what is very important is you have the real things, the real world stuff is here, but most of the conversation is taking place here in relation to ESG credit agencies in particular and investor-driven governance network. So this is climate finance, that's what we are talking about, and that's what we want, it's here. But the connection between the two is far from obvious. And they detail the reason why those channels are weak in this paper that I recommend. So alas, why that doesn't work very well? The first argument is an argument that, in fact, you have a lot of greenwashing. That's not surprising. But that's not the only one. You have also a problem of wrong prices and more generally, a fallacy of green finance that I will detail. So greenwashing. So this is from a paper from a former master student. For Narolia, he was working, I think last year, he was last year in the program. And he worked with other people that looked at what was taking place in Mexico. And in Mexico, you had a lot of investment in the clean energy, but in fact, that clean energy was built with the support of the European Central Bank. Why? Because the European Central Bank was heavily supported this firm that is Iberdrola that was investing there by buying its bond. So it was buying a lot of bonds from that corporation, which helped to fill those investments. But people on the ground, they were not happy. They say that nicely, but they are very unhappy. Why? Because in fact, you see how their land is. They cannot use that land anymore, and there used to be a lot of problems concerning the legality of those investments and so on and so forth. But here, of course, the ECB is not aware of that. The ECB is just looking at the carbon balance of that corporation, and it's helping it a lot because he has no clue to follow that more closely. There are also people that are well connected and that say what's taking place. And I think it was nicer 1 year ago that would be have been better to make the talk, because now we know that all people from BlackRock just kick that out, so it's not a surprise. But they say that very clearly. Tariq Fancy was working at BlackRock. He was in fact the chief investment officer for sustainable investing at BlackRock during 1 year and a half. And they explained that while working at BlackRock, he was helping to popularize this idea that green investment, ESG, could be a way to deal with the major market failures that are taking place due as climate change and the ecological crisis. And he's saying that in fact those senior executives was exaggerating the impact. And in fact they were knowingly misleading, actively misleading people about the extent to which this purpose in terms of investment could really affect on the ground. So that's for BlackRock, the US, but in Europe that's not very much better. You have this woman, Desiree Fixler, that used to work for an affiliate of Deutsche Bank Group. She was hired there in 2020, and when she arrived, she realized that those investments, she was sustainability officer, that there was a big gap between their public ESG claims and the reality of their ESG effort. And in fact, a number of their ESG statements were just weak, lacking any kind of substance, and some were just wrong. And following the publicization of that information, there was an inquiry by the police, and something that was very impressive is that, I think that, yeah, you can see that, is that following the intervention of the police, they of course revised their balance sheet, and the result of that there was 75% less than a year earlier green investment in their portfolio. So they were lying at a 75% rate, which is already meaningful. But you can do better than 75. You can do 98% of bullshit. So this is a paper from last September about green bonds in the US. So they are looking at all the green bonds that were emitted in the US since 2014 up to 2023. That's mainly municipal bonds and corporate bonds. And what they are looking at, is there any meaningful difference between the use of those funds in terms of impact on nature vis-à-vis usual funds? That's this idea of additionality, meaning that those bonds should participate in the funding of beneficial, environmentally beneficial projects. And in fact, the vast majority of green bonds proceed is used just to finance ordinary debt. So you put that green because it's not specifically polluting, but that's just green as it was before, not green, but that's the same kind of investment. There is nothing specific in that. Only 2% of those bonds were having a meaningful impact. So 2% over 100% of emission, it's huge. It's really, I don't know how to overstate that. So of course, that's the first problem with ESG and more generally green finance, is that there is no specifically reliable information. That's not specifically new, so we can discuss a lot of that. There was a report by IMF a couple of years ago. There are some progress with the issue of taxonomy in Europe, so we can discuss that more, but still the baseline is very, very depressing. The second problem is the problem of what we could call the profit problem. You could know where to invest. You could agree to invest in that, and still you can lack investment. That's the demonstration that has been made by Brett Christopher in this crucial book. The price is wrong means that, in fact, we saw that since now oil, coal, and gas are more expensive to produce electricity than is our renewable energy, we were hoping that we will have a very drastic and very rapid shift toward renewable energy. There has been some shift, of course, but not very rapid on the one hand, and moreover, as soon as subsidies are stopped, there is no more rush. So why is that taking place? Why environmental targets remain elusive in spite of the fact that sustainable energy is cost competitive for already several years? So this is the price of solar panel in black, wind here, and you see that it's well below coal, gas, and nuclear. So around 2010, we had much more expensive renewable energy than other sources, and since 2016, we had a change. And this is what's taking place. Look at, so it's at the world level, year-on-year growth in global electricity output by source generation. What you can see is that overall there is an increase of electricity output by overall, but fossil fuels is above solar and wind and other sources. So you have more capacity that are going to the brown generation than to the green generation. Though that doesn't mean that there is no green generation capacity that are implemented. There is a lot of green investment in electricity generation, but that's still, we still have an increase in brown capacity of electricity generation. So why? Why, unless, why we green electricity profitability, why we have that? It's because green electricity profitability is elusive. That's the point of Brett Christopher. Why, unless externally forced, would the electricity industry accept, let alone actively embrace, a highly disruptive transition that lowered production costs? So that's true, there is less production cost. But in the meantime, that's so little, if any, of the resulting efficiency gains accruing to the industry across actors. So basically, you can have lower cost, but if you are not able to capture the rents accruing from those diminishing costs, nobody will invest into that. And that's the core of his argument. There are more technical dimensions, of course, of the argument. Part of that, it's because you have a very significant upfront investment. There is this problem of low entry barrier. There is this problem of cannibalization effect. So as soon as you have a lot of investment, you have a drop in prices which stop the capacity of the sector to invest more. There are also issues of connection to the network. So there are many things. But the bottom of the core of the argument, it's this. So going back to our general argument, the problem is not only that we do not have the good information about what is really done on the ground, it's even if we know what is done on the ground, without some forms of coordination, incentives to invest, even with lower cost, will not drive the green transition in the good direction. And some people are saying that very clearly. This is from Shell CEO during 2022 earnings call with investor. He explained, okay, I think on low carbon. I think categorically on this. That's very important. But we cannot justify going for a low return. If we cannot achieve the double-digit returns in a business, we need to question very hard whether we should continue. We want to continue to go for lower and lower and lower carbon. So we used to be for Trump, but it has to be profitable. So that's the thing. Say maybe there is a general spirit that could be good, but even a CEO from a big oil corporation cannot look at something else than the profit, and you do not have the same kind of profit with renewable than you have with fossil fuels. So that's something, and we are going back to our friend from Tariq Franci from BlackRock. There is no such a thing as doing well by doing good. And here there is a logical problem with ESG. Either if money flows to green company, the idea is that you have a green label in order to invite companies to invest. So the idea is that they should have a better funding condition, that should be less expensive to fund their activities. But of course, from the point of view of the investors, if you are proposing cheaper capital, that means that you will get a lower return. So ESG investing only makes the world better to the extent that it accepts to lower returns to investors. So this idea that you can have both, it's a logical fallacy. Because, of course, you can have both, but if you have both, it means that the market is functioning already well, and there is no need for ESG. There is already a correct processing of the instrument, and in that case, ESG is pointless. So this is the first dimension of the logical fallacy of ESG. There is another, I think, important fallacy of ESG. It's a fallacy of composition. So you have some kind of greenium. So greenium is the fact that, indeed, it's a little bit less expensive for company to invest in green than in other activities. So you have some benefits from company. But if you think about that, investors that are accepting this greenium, so this lower return, that means that in order to support sustainable impact, if you think about the dynamic of that, that means that those sectors have cumulatively less capital than the brown sector that are getting a higher return. So in terms of capitalist dynamics, that means that the brown sector is growing more rapidly than endogenously than the green sector. So I think that's also something very important to have in mind, is that if you are not able to reduce the profitability of the brown sector, it will just get more powerful and have a bigger impact. So, alas for ESG and green central banking. Greenwashing, the profit problem, the fact that there is a logical fallacy on relying of lower returns to transform the economy as the three main logical obstacles or empirical obstacles to the development of green finance. Which means that we should put green finance in its place. And that will be the kind of conclusion of that first part that I would like to make. And I would like to make that argument relying on people that you probably know, in particular Roman Schwarzman, that is part of the, let's say, Epoch ecosystem, and other people working in various central banks. So that was a report that was commissioned by the Bank of International Settlement and written within the Banque de France. And what they say basically is that they say, of course, there are huge stakes with climate. They agree with Carney that, of course, there is a risk for financial stability and so on and so forth. However, it's not sufficient to look at central bank to deal with the problem. They are arguing against green monetary dominance, if you want. They say that integration of climate-related risk into prudential regulation and into monetary policy will not suffice. We need other way other policy tools. And that's specifically problematic for central bank because there is a lot of pressure on them to play a new role. However, such calls are excessive and unfair. They do not have the tools to properly play a meaningful role in terms of transforming the investment landscape to face the ecological challenge. So I think this is a very nice argument, very important argument, that say that what is taking place in terms of funding the green bifurcation cannot be driven by central banks that are just playing directly on the financial market. There is an argument that has been made by people a little bit surprisingly, and this is from Derek Brower. He used to be US energy editor, and 2 years ago, 1 year and a half ago, he explained that capitalism won't deliver the energy transition fast enough. And this argument was already beyond that. Markets cannot deal with that because it's too much money, too much coordination, and there is a global south issue that needs to be taken into account. That means that only big government can deal with that. That was his argument. And you have finally Milton Friedman. And I think that he's right. I agree with Friedman. What Friedman is saying that there is no such a thing as corporate social responsibility. The doctrine of social responsibility taken seriously would extend the scope of the political mechanism to every human activity. In a free society, there is one and only one social responsibility of business, is to increase its profit. So that's very well known. But I think that in fact is giving the solution. Since we cannot rely on business to deal with the problem, we need to go to the top, which means that we need to extend the scope of the political mechanism. We need to extend the scope of the political mechanism. And this is, in fact, the argument that was already made a long time ago by William Kapp when he explained that the pursuit of private gains places a premium on the minimization of private costs. So we cannot rely on private incentives to deal with externalities. The more reliance on an economic system placed on private incentives, the more on the pursuit of private gains, the greater the danger that it will give rise to external unpaid social costs. So that's the same argument, in fact, as Friedman, I think. You have an inability of corporation to incorporate other dimensions than their bottom line. So let's follow Friedman's advice and look how we could enlarge the political mechanism. So that will be the second part of my presentation, and I will be a little bit more rapid about that. That's some elements that were developed in the book that we published with Razmik Koshin last year. So the argument that we are making is that the conditions for planning in the age of algorithm have changed. So that's the first argument. You have this argument that was made a long time ago in the 80s by Ernest Mandel, and he was very courageous because we were in the 80s, and in the 80s nobody believed anymore in planning. And he said that look at what's taking place in real world excuse me, sorry. In real world capitalism. In real world capitalism, you have more and more and more planning. That's corporate planning, that's private planning, but that's planning. Why? Because corporations are extending their reach even beyond their own frontiers. That was the beginning of internationalization of value chains. So he said, in fact, you have this extension of planning, which create the material condition for public planning. And this argument, we are continuing this argument with Anna Bensussan and Cécilia Ricap in a paper about corporate planning in the last century, looking at what Harvard Business Review is saying about that. But that's something very important. Look at corporate planning and you will see that, in fact, they are planning. You need to think about that. The second argument is that, in fact, against Hayek, there was other people that were taking seriously the issue of knowledge. And in particular, this guy, it's Bettelheim. Bettelheim. And Bettelheim was a scholar here based in Paris. He was specialized in planning. It was a theoretician, but also he was involved in many debates. In Algeria, in Cuba, there is a long exchange with Che Guevara. He went also in India. So he was participating in a lot of debate. And he was perfectly aware of the difficulty of planning. He was not saying just plan, just socialize the means of production and everything will be okay. He said, no, that's much more complicated. Why? Because you cannot rely only on juridical formalism. You can have you can have legal property on assets, but that doesn't mean that you are able to plan. You need economic property and possession. What is economic property and possession? Economic property is your ability to control the profit or the surplus and to allocate that to investment. And possession is the ability to regulate, control the labor process, and to manage the labor process, so the technologies, the organization of work. And effective planning depends on the reach that you can have on those two dimensions. If you are just the legal ownership, but in fact you are not able to control financial flows or have a meaningful idea about how the labor process is taking place, then there is no such a thing as planning. So planning depends on information forces. The determination of the economic subject, so the subject that is able to plan, to have a productive project that is consistent, depend on its ability to transmit information, memorize it, and process it. 1975. So he was very aware of those issues. And of course, that means that the advances made in the sphere of information techniques may have considerable practical consequences for the possibility of planning. So this argument is very interesting because it's, on the one hand, a little bit like Hayek. He acknowledged that planning depends on knowledge, but on the other hand, he explained that it's not high historical. It depends on the context, it depends on development. And of course, right now, with information technology and so on and so forth, the debate has changed drastically. So you have Jack Ma. Jack Ma is a former head of Alibaba, but you know, in China, big tech were dealt differently than from in the US, so he's much more sidelined now. But before this sideline, he made this argument. I think that thanks to artificial intelligence, multiple intelligence, our perception of the world will be elevated to a new level. And at that moment, it will be possible to plan and to predict market forces so as to allow us to have finally achieved a planned economy. So he was explaining that we will have a planned economy. And some people follow his steps. And you have on the left people that are thinking about this idea of computerized planning. That's people around Paul Cockshott. And so he wrote a paper so a couple of years ago, explaining that yes, using Kantorovich algorithm, it's possible to find a way to combine various techniques with pre-given resources to fulfill a plan. So we can combine, we have the computing power, we are able to do an optimal computerized planning. And even built an algorithm to propose a way to do that. So I'm sure that you're sure that people that were fond of Hayek were convinced by this argument. Of course, they were not. They explained that you miss completely the point, Jack Ma and Cockshott. There is no such a thing as a knowledge that you can just take on the ground and centralize. And so the knowledge of the market is not dispersed as bits and pieces through the economy that must be collected and computed. It's contextual, it's embedded in context, and in fact, from their own point of view, it depends on exchangeable private property, so the market process. So they don't believe in this idea of computerized planning. So for them, techno-feudalism turns out to be unfeasible in principle. So we are going back to Hayek, not at all recognizing the argument of Bettelheim. And we have, in fact, a third position. And I think that's a very good position. It has been developed by Sylvia Riep. And what she said, she's an Austrian scholar, and she said that data analytics by itself, if divorced from the organization of the economic institutions and from critical analysis of techno-scientific objectification, doesn't automatically equal socialist, emancipatory, or effective planning. So I think that's bright. That's exactly what needs to be said. On the one hand, it opens new possibilities for planning, but on the other hand, it's not enough, and planning is not just about calculation. It's also about broader institutions that we need to discuss. In fact, if you want to plan democratically, you need to rely on various forms of knowledge. So you have on the one hand, so this is the socialist calculation debate redux. You have the three positions. So I will be very rapid on that. Everybody knows the socialist calculation debate or not really? Yeah. So I will be very short, just to be sure that everybody catch up. So you had, on the one hand, planners that are neoclassic. They say that we can have a central planner that is just gathering prices and coordinating the economy that way. That will be longer. So we have prices and we have centralization and we can make optimal things. It could be close to the argument of computerizable planning that I mentioned earlier. On the other hand, you have people like Hayek that explain that you have price, but knowledge is necessarily dispersed and tacit. So you cannot plan efficiently. And you have a third position. That was the position of Neurath that said, okay, knowledge is dispersed, but still you can plan. You have some room for planning, but that necessitates a political process of deliberation. And I think, of course, this position is much smarter. So the argument of Otto Neurath, and I think he's also looks nice now, it was an argument with Hayek, an argument against Hayek. With Hayek, he explained that he agreed 100% with Hayek concerning the dispersible nature of knowledge. I am the sworn enemy of the illusion of complete knowledge. And from this point of view, I think Professor von Hayek should congratulate me and appreciate my unceasing effort to destroy such chimeras. So it's very clear. But on the other hand, contra Hayek, he assumed that there is an impossible dispersal of technical knowledge. Remember what I told you at the beginning, that for Hayek, you have some knowledge that are embodied in bureaucracies, in the state, because it necessitates some specific apparatus to gather. But that knowledge can be dispersed to ordinary people to help them make decisions. So what is saying one of the followers of Neurath, John O'Neill, is that not true. That's true that you cannot centralize all knowledge, but that's also true that you cannot disperse all knowledge. And just make a thought experiment. You cannot go in the supermarket and be a rational ecological agent. You have no chance. You're defeated, or you buy nothing. But beyond that, you have no chance to be rational. So I think this argument is very important. There is an impossible dispersal of technical knowledge, which of course gives room to the possibility of centralization. So planning is a battlefield. And that's what we'll say at the end, Otto Neurath. There is a democratic moment that is necessary by building the legitimacy for planning, but also to allowing for deliberation between possible scenarios that are must be judged in value and that cannot be optimized. But on the other hand, there is a technical moment. You cannot have a proper deliberation if you do not have some forms of assessment of feasibility. Feasibility is a key concept, will say Vassily Leontiev. So we need this assessment, this scenario building in order to be able to do that. So at the end of the day, the debate is a constant battle between the expert and the man in the street, between democracy and technocracy. That's the fate of planning. There is no magic planning. That's a tension. So I'm moving toward the end of my presentation, or I should do that at least. So I will very briefly present 3 institutions that we discussed in the book. Only 3 institutions because we are discussing other dimensions that we will not engage with. We are discussing augmented democracy. We are discussing the role of algorithm in order to emancipate demand. But I would just like to focus on 3 dimensions: ecological accounting, matrix calculation of lifestyles, and socialization of investment. So the first thing, I think it's very obvious, but we have to say that because that's not put at the very beginning of any serious discussion. If you want to have any kind of consistent ecological policy, if you want to have any forms of consistent ecological planning, you just need to have proper accounting regarding the ecology. If you do not know what is taking place, you have no chance to be able to assess or to make rational decisions on that point of view. So building proper ecological accounting is crucial. And that's not doing what is taking place now. This is from the IFRS, and they explain that they will have better accounting at the firm level. But look at the details. At the details, they will look at the value an organization creates for others when it affects the ability of the organization to create value for itself. It's not very clear? Let's see here. You account for interaction with nature and society only when it's material to the organization's ability to create value for itself. So you are looking at the impact on the environment if it could come back and affect your ability to make profit. So this financial materiality only is really not consistent from proper ecological planning. There are other ways to do that, and of course it's problematic, but we have, Musk and the others are just sending thousands of satellites in the sky, but with that, you have a new form of knowledge for humanity. Knowledge, new things that it was not able to know before. And one example that I think is very important is, so you have Planet Labs, which is connected to Google and Amazon, that is doing some stuff in terms of measuring biodiversity. So there are some tools that are implemented right now. There are also a French corporation, Kairos, that is specialized in energy data. And they are making photography every day. They get the photography through the satellite network every day in order to be able to assess 200,000 industrial assets. And they are doing that continuously. And which means that they are able to assess in real time production, consumption, and storage on global scale of energy. So that's very important. If you want to plan, if you have an idea about what's going on to your the ecological dynamic at the world scale, that's crucial, of course. And they are showing interesting things. They show, for instance, that industrial plants are in fact between 3 and 10 times, depending on countries, emitting more methane than they acknowledge. So that's also closing a gap that we must do that. So that's just an example, but to say that we have new sources of knowledge. We have, in fact, some are talking about a new era of progress. So that's not very common sense, but it's Søren Born, maybe some of you know him. It's a sociologist from Sweden, and he makes this argument by saying that we have new way to understand what's going on at the world scale, and this is building a new human consciousness, a consciousness of us as a species. And we need to think about agency at that level, especially concerning ecological planning. So I will not enter into the detail, but you can connect micro accounting at the firm levels and macro accounting. That's the kind of thing that need to be done. If you don't just want to retain one word about that, it's from a French accountant, André Vanoli. And André Vanoli, he talked about the idea of a permanent inventory of nature. We need a permanent inventory of nature. A permanent inventory of nature doesn't mean that you know everything about nature, but as much as we can in order to be able to assess our impact and to manage that. Second institution, it's making scenarios. We explained that ecological planning was in fact choosing between various feasible options. And this is, I think, a very important point that could help clarify some confusion that we have nowadays between various ways of talking about planning. This is from the rapport Pisani-Mahfouz. That was a rapport that was presented to the French Prime Minister two years ago. And I like this table because it's making a comparison between the strategy in terms of carbon pricing, incentives, so subsidies, and planning. So carbon pricing is very nice. You have economic efficiencies, it brings you money, but low credibility. It doesn't work very well. We are not very able to assess to what extent it will help to transform the structure. Incentive is fantastic because people are very happy to get some money to buy new stuff, but there is no direct link with the target. It's not effective. The only one that is consistent with quantitative targeting is planning. So I think that's very important to acknowledge that. Even at the core of the Macron era, what he said, this is the doctrine. And how do you plan? And I think that here we begin to have some discussion. Because they explain that planning emission trajectory should be made planned sector by sector and by evaluating abatement cost and their future trends. And we can do that using regulatory tools and also credit allocation mechanism. They say that developing countries, but we can think in France also, I think. So what is the problem here? I think that everything is almost okay, but the problem is sector by sector. If you build scenario, you cannot do that sector by sector. You need to think about interdependency between sectors. You need Leontief, you need input-output. So that's what is crucial from my point of view. We need some forms of intersectoral calculation to be able to choose between various lifestyles. Planning, ecological planning, in fact, planning about lifestyles, it's about, and that could be done only at the intersectoral level. And so here you have a photography of Bogdanov, because I think that he's the real inventor of the input-output database. There is a small text of 1921 when he explains the two main principles, intersectoral chaining and the law of minimum. But the key argument is this one. What we need to decide is what are the space of possible scenarios. So we need a matrix calculation as a precondition to have a proper deliberative exercise about planning options. And at that moment, we can connect ecological calculation with which is in natura calculation, with economic cost-based calculation. That's the only way to do that. We have people working on that. We have research doing that. For instance, you have this paper by Julien Lefebvre, just published in Economic System Research, that is trying to make that connection between integrated assessment model and input-output analysis to try to think about scenarios. So we have modern tools in that direction, and that's very important. We need to acknowledge the fact that what is behind this technical stuff is in fact a proper way to deliberate about ecological planning. Finally, last institution, it's the socialization of investment. The socialization of investment. When we are talking about planning, we are planning about one specific thing. And the specific thing that we are talking about is the fact that we need to decide about investment. Socialization of investment, it's, of course, a very widely discussed thing. You have a Keynesian classic. This is from a report written by Keynes and others, but the socialization of investment part was written by Keynes for the Liberal British Party in 1978. And at that moment, what was Keynes saying is that we need a socialization of investment in order to secure an approximation of full employment. But in this, so there are two texts. This is from the treatise, but this is from the general theory, and here he was more going into the detail about what kind of investment should be done. So he was already in that. But what is very important is that you cannot discuss socialization of investment only in terms of level. You need necessarily to have a qualitative discussion in terms of what kind of investment you are doing. And Keynes was already aware of that. He didn't work a lot of that, of course, but he was talking about a board of national investment to select, oversee, coordinate, and finance investment. So he was aware of this issue. In the Anthropocene, of course, it's a little bit different. The objective is strong sustainability. So that's a main difference. The main constraint should be on the side of the ecological footprint. And that means also that we have something new. We need to acknowledge the fact that we need to fund the dismantling of some activities, and in the meantime, clean infrastructure. So that means that the issue of employment is not a problem. There are a lot of discussion in terms of diminishing labor time and so on and so forth to the global bifurcation. I'm not a proponent of that. For what reason? Because we need more work in the short run. We need a lot of work to dismantle the brown stuff and a lot of work to build the green stuff. And we still need to consume what we need. So that's a lot of work in the short run. The problem, in fact, do we have enough, or how can we distribute that effort? And democracy, of course, we discussed that already. So we can think about how to socialize investment. And historically, there are many examples of the socialization of investment. And you have, for instance, in Swedish social democracy, you have a lot of socialization of investment, but only at the firm level. That was the Meidner plan, that almost took control of private capital in Sweden, but in a very decentralized way. You do not have intersectoral coordination. On the contrary, you have developmentalism, many sorts of it, including South Korea, France after World War II, Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of discussion that we can have about that. But what we need is something like that. We need, including worker participation, our autonomy, and cross-sector socialization. But that's the scope that we need. So what it is concretely socialization of investment? This is a text from Michel Husson in 1991, and they explain that, in fact, we need to put between the needs and what is produced, not the filter of profitability, but the filter of democracy, of deliberation. And how we do that? So we discussed, we have priorities, but then we can have institutions to do that. And the institutions are the following one. One institution is nationalization of strategic aid. So that's basically France post-World War II, but that's also the case in China nowadays. So you have developmental assets that you can mobilize as a state to manage your economy. Credit policy, crucial tool, credit policy, because credit policy allows you to have priorities, but not to go into the detail of the technology of the labor process, where you can still have a vivid entrepreneurial activities. Public asset management. So I will not discuss that technically, but that's something very modern. How you could have a kind of BlackRock, public BlackRock, to intervene in the investment discussion. And all of that could work with some varieties of ownership. You could have public ownership, private ownership, co-op, and so on and so forth. But the key issue, of course, is that you need a high profit tax, because if you have no high profit tax, you are not really socializing investment. So you can have some profits, but high profit tax is decisive to control the broad investment function. Conclusion. So I have 3 minutes to a last idea. There is no magic planning device to deal with the Anthropocene. There is no magic bullet to deal with the problem of knowledge in the Anthropocene. We have only bad and difficult options, but we need to find a kind of balance to navigate that. And I would propose to think about that using this idea of Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes, he gave at the Collège de France in 1976, 1977, a course whose title was Living Together. And the argument of Roland Barthes is that he wants idiorhythmy. What is idiorhythmy? It's the fact that everybody has his own rhythm. Of course, that's the idea that it's a fantasy of a lifestyle that you are neither alone nor suffering the pressure of the collective. So you don't want to be alone, you don't want to be pressured too much by the collectives. So you can live a life according to your own rhythm without being alone. That's what he's looking for. And of course, there is no perfect bullet for that. So he's revising various religious orders that are trying to balance that. So that's a very nice book. But I think that I like the way he framed that. He proposed to have a kind of utopia of socialism of the distance, to have this kind of interplay between individuals that allow each to escape the diktat of heterorhythmy, so the rhythm of the others. We have this kind of debate right now on the left concerning planning. Part of the degrowth movement, following, for instance, Coesato, will insist that we must degrow in order to fight against socialization of productive forces. What is saying Coesato, and I think that's very true, is that in fact, with what we inherited from capitalism, there is no such a thing as the ability of workers to, by their own, conduct their task autonomously. They are subjective to these capital productive forces. And that's also true, of course, for nature, that is, due to the development of productive forces, is affected necessarily. So if you want to have a completely different lifestyle, you need to downscale the production and to abandon part of the productive forces developed by capital. And on the other hand, you have people on the, this Matt Huber, who in fact wrote very good paper on regulation school theory and energy in the US in the 80s. I recommend you that part of his work. But he's making the argument against Sato that the problem is not growth, it's the control over the investment function. So we just need to have to socialize the investment function, and then we will be able to plan. Well, my answer will be both are wrong and right. We need to, there is no magic bullet. We need to navigate those two tensions that are very true. On the one hand, there is a reification of productive forces inherited from capital without doubt. Individuals, nature is reified by the process of technology built by capital, and we are inheriting from that. But on the other hand, we are also benefiting from that huge power of socialization that we are inherited from capital. Think about 1 second everything that is taking place in this room in terms of labor process that were gathered in order to allow us to be here. How many millions of people were contributing to that? Several, I think. So we are really relying on that. But we can accept that only to the extent that we master them, I would say, we subordinate them to democratically legitimate purposes. But on the other hand, we should also decide to limit those forces, to limit the reach of planning, to preserve some space of autonomy. So we need to have some area of non-planned activities, giving room for individuals' autonomy and nature non-identity. Thank you very much for your attention.